Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. The galaxy had long been a place of shifting allegiances, where deals were struck in the dark corners of space stations and powerful factions battled for dominance. Amid this turbulent backdrop, one small, isolated world had become the unexpected focus of an intergalactic transaction. Karnar 9, a rugged planet on the edge of the Sphyron system, was hardly what one might call an ideal place for a meeting of high-ranking officials. Its surface was a patchwork of rocky landscapes, thick forests, and hostile terrain, with only a handful of settlements spread out across the hostile wilderness. Yet, for a man like Arlen Voss, it was the perfect location to broker a deal. Arlen was a war hero, an enigmatic figure whose reputation had spread across the galaxy like wildfire. A survivor of the brutal Galathian War, he was known for his cunning, adaptability, and most notably his reputation as a master negotiator. The Galactic Council, knowing of Arlen's persuasive skills, often turned to him when things became complicated. And complicated things were. Arlen had been summoned to Karnar 9 under the auspices of a diplomatic envoy from the Amarak Dominion, a powerful alien race known for their advanced technology and ruthless politics. Their leader, High Matriarch Vriza, had a rare and valuable commodity on her hands, a young alien girl, sold to the Dominion in a rare and savage exchange. The girl, a member of the Zira species, was an anomaly. Beautiful, highly intelligent, and with an ability to manipulate energies in ways that no other species could replicate. Her name was Lyra. However, Lyra was not an ordinary servant. Despite her exotic features and remarkable abilities, she had become a liability to the Dominion. The Amarak were all too familiar with the concept of power, but Lyra's powers were unstable, unpredictable, and dangerous. Yet they saw an opportunity. Rather than deal with her instability, they would trade her away to the one person they believed could harness her potential. Arlen, ever the diplomat, had arrived on Karnar 9 to finalize the deal. He had no interest in making enemies with the Amarak, but neither did he care much for their convoluted politics. The only thing that mattered to him was the deal he had been presented. Lyra, a powerful asset, offered to him as a servant in exchange for the clearing of some minor debts. It was a simple trade, a transaction that could have been easily dismissed if not for the fact that Arlen had his own reasons for agreeing. He knew that in the vast reaches of the galaxy, a skilled servant could be more valuable than a fleet of warships. And Lyra's potential was something he wasn't about to ignore. As the meeting room doors slid open, Arlen's gaze fell upon the girl. She stood in the center of the room, her posture rigid, her large violet eyes watching him intently. Her black hair cascaded down her back, shimmering with subtle bioluminescence under the harsh overhead lighting. She wore a simple tunic, her skin a shade of deep blue that matched the undercurrents of an oceanic world. Though she was slender, her presence was commanding. Arlen did not react outwardly, but internally he felt a flicker of recognition. He had dealt with countless species over his career, but never one like Lyra. The Zira species had long been regarded as a mystery, their origins, their abilities, and their culture all shrouded in secrecy. Her species was rumored to have once been one of the most advanced in the galaxy, until they mysteriously vanished from history. "You are Lyra," Arlen said, his voice calm, controlled. He met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. Lyra did not answer immediately. Instead, she tilted her head, her alien features betraying little emotion. "I am," she replied at last, her voice soft but firm. "And you are the one they have sent to claim me." Vriza, the High Matriarch, stood beside Arlen, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. "She is a gift, Voss, a tool for your disposal. Handle her as you see fit, but remember, her powers are volatile, and her loyalty is something you will need to cultivate. The Dominion cannot afford another failure." Arlen nodded, though he couldn't shake the sense that there was more to this transaction than met the eye. Lyra, as much as she was a tool to be wielded, also seemed to be a player in a much larger game. "I understand," Arlen said, his voice laced with the authority that had earned him respect throughout the galaxy. "I will take her into my service, as agreed." Vriza smiled, a cold, predatory expression. Good. Then the deal is concluded. With that, Lyra was led away, her future now bound to Arlen's ship. It was a strange arrangement, one that neither side seemed entirely happy with, but it was what it was. As the doors to the meeting room closed behind them, Arlen turned to Vriza one last time. "And what will you do with your debts?" Arlen asked, a knowing glint in his eyes. Vriza's smile faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. "That, Mr. Voss, is no longer your concern. You have what you came for." As Arlen left the station and boarded his ship, Lyra at his side, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stepped into something far bigger than a simple trade. The girl, with her strange powers and her enigmatic nature, had the potential to change everything. And though she had been given to him as a servant, Arlen couldn't help but wonder if the true purpose of their bond would only reveal itself in time. But for now, there was nothing to do but move forward. They were bound together for better or worse. And Arlen, for all his cynicism, was certain of one thing: nothing about this would be easy. The journey back to Arlen's flagship was a quiet one. Lyra had been assigned a small quarters adjacent to Arlen's own, a cabin that was stark and utilitarian. It was a space far from the splendor she had likely once known. Yet Arlen had instructed that the room be furnished with the necessities: a bed, a table, a chair. There were no luxurious trappings, no opulent tapestries or delicate adornments. She was here to serve, after all. Lyra did not speak much during the journey. She simply stood by the window of the shuttle bay, staring out into the swirling void of space, as though lost in thought. Her expression remained unreadable, a calm facade that Arlen found both unsettling and fascinating. Her powers, as Vriza had warned, were something to be handled with care. It was said that Lyra could harness energy with a mere thought, but the extent of that ability was still unknown. Could have been dangerous, even fatal, if provoked. Arlen could sense her wariness, the tension in her body as she stood, seemingly disconnected from the world around her. It was as if she had withdrawn into herself, the remnants of her life before this betrayal still clinging to her like a veil. She had been a prize, a tool to be traded away, and the exchange had left its mark on her. For a while, Arlen simply observed her from a distance. He was a man accustomed to negotiating with powerful figures, whether they be high-ranking officials or mercenary leaders, but Lyra was unlike anyone he had encountered before. Her beauty, her presence, even her silence, commanded something he could not quite place. There was a defiance within her, a spark that he knew would be difficult to extinguish. When the ship finally entered the gravitational pull of Arlen's flagship, the vessel slowed to a gentle halt. The engines hummed a low, resonant tone, and Arlen gave the signal to disembark. Lyra was given no special treatment as she was escorted down the halls of the ship. Crew members barely gave her a second glance. She was simply another servant, albeit one who was quite different from the rest. She did not meet their eyes as they passed, and though there was little warmth in the ship's sterile halls, there was an undeniable air of curiosity that followed her. Arlen led her to her quarters, which were situated far from his own personal chambers. The ship was a vast, labyrinthine thing, designed for comfort and efficiency, but there were still pockets of isolation, places where one could disappear if they chose. Lyra's quarters, though modest, were private, and that was the only kindness Arlen offered her. "You will remain here," Arlen said, his voice cold but not unkind. "Your duties will begin tomorrow." Lyra did not respond, her expression still unreadable. She only nodded and stepped into the room, allowing the door to close behind her. Arlen lingered for a moment, his thoughts turning inward. He knew that the girl would not be content in such a role. Even if she accepted it for now, that acceptance was only temporary. No one, not even a powerful alien like Lyra, could simply submit to servitude without consequence. As the hours passed, Arlen retreated to his own quarters, leaving the girl to adjust to her new life. He didn't know what he had expected. Perhaps some sign of rebellion, some challenge to his authority. But instead, Lyra's silence was a wall, impenetrable and disconcerting. It was as though she were waiting for something, for a chance to prove herself, or for an opportunity to escape. The next morning, Arlen made his way to the galley where he met with his crew. They were preparing for a series of meetings with various political factions, but the subject of Lyra came up more than once. It wasn't hard to see that the crew was curious about the girl. A powerful alien in servitude was a strange sight, and everyone wanted to know why Arlen had agreed to take her on. "Boss," one of the officers, Grish, said with a raised eyebrow as Arlen entered the room, "You sure about this one? The Zira are no joke." "A servant? You're not looking to start an uprising, are you?" Arlen didn't respond immediately, instead grabbing a cup of lukewarm coffee and leaning against the counter. His face was a mask of indifference, but inwardly, he was already turning over the complexities of his decision. It had been a simple transaction on paper, a gift, a bargain. But in his gut, something told him that Lyra was more than just an asset. "I'm sure," Arlen finally said, his voice steady. "I've seen enough to know what she's capable of. She'll prove useful." Grish, still skeptical, didn't push the subject further. But it was clear that the crew was already speculating on the relationship between Arlen and his noob servant. Rumors would spread quickly. Arlen knew that the tension between him and Lyra, this uneasy power dynamic, was bound to unravel eventually. Whether that unraveling would bring about rebellion or understanding remained to be seen. Meanwhile, Lyra remained locked in her quarters, her own mind working through the strange and painful reality of her new life. She had no choice but to comply for the time being. She had been raised in a world of rigid hierarchy, a society where power was everything, and yet her role had always been that of a leader, not a servant. Being stripped of that autonomy, her future now dictated by Arlen Voss, a human no less, was a bitter pill to swallow. But Lyra was no fool. She had not survived the fall of her own people by merely following orders. If Arlen thought she would simply bow to him, he was mistaken. She had her own plans, her own power, and when the time was right, she would make her move. But for now, she would bide her time. Her fingers brushed against the surface of the desk in her quarters. A faint hum resonated beneath her touch, a reminder of her untapped potential. Energy pulsed through her fingertips, ready to be harnessed, ready to be wielded. But not yet. Not until she was certain that Arlen had underestimated her. In the silence of her room, Lyra smiled faintly. It was a smile filled with secrets. Secrets that she would keep to herself, at least for now. Days passed aboard Arlen's ship, and the tension between him and Lyra continued to simmer beneath the surface. Arlen's crew quickly adapted to her presence, though there was an air of wariness whenever she crossed their paths. Lyra remained largely in her quarters, emerging only when absolutely necessary to fulfill her duties. She had not yet begun to speak to Arlen directly. He was aware of her silent resistance, but he made no overtures to change it. He had enough experience with people like her, people who were either too proud or too broken to bend easily. He didn't expect her to submit right away, not when she was so far from her home and surrounded by strangers. And yet, part of him couldn't shake the sense that she was hiding something more than her volatile power. Arlen spent his days focused on the mission that had brought him and his crew to the outskirts of the sector. Negotiations with rival factions, power plays within galactic politics. These were his priorities. Yet his mind would often drift to Lyra, wondering if she was truly as compliant as she appeared or if she was simply biding her time. One morning, after a grueling meeting with a faction of smugglers, Arlen returned to his quarters to find Lyra waiting for him. She was standing by the window, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of stars beyond. Her body was tense, but there was an odd sort of stillness about her, as if she had reached some kind of decision. "You need something?" Arlen asked, his voice neutral. Lyra turned to face him, her expression unreadable. For the first time since their meeting, there was a flicker of something in her eyes. A challenge, an invitation to engage. "I want to know what you expect of me," she said, her voice steady but with an edge to it. Arlen paused. He hadn't anticipated this directness. Most of his crew, when faced with his leadership, simply followed orders. Lyra, however, had never been one to conform. There was no pretension in her words, but there was an underlying force. It was as if she was testing him, pushing him to reveal his intentions. "What do you mean?" Arlen asked, his curiosity piqued. Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you want from me? Why did you take me on? You know I'm not just a servant. You know I'm more than that." Arlen took a step forward, studying her carefully. "You're right. I know what you are. But it doesn't change the fact that you're under my command now." Lyra's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "And how long do you think that will last? How long before you realize that you're holding on to something you can't control?" The words were a challenge, a test of sorts. Arlen's brow furrowed as he took in the weight of her statement. She was playing a dangerous game, trying to push him into a corner. But he couldn't deny that there was a strange truth to her words. She was powerful, and that power had not been fully realized. Not by him, and certainly not by the Amarak. She had the potential to break free, to disrupt everything if she so chose. "You think you can just escape?" Arlen's voice was low, his tone almost contemplative. "I think I can do more than that," Lyra replied, her gaze never leaving his. There was an unspoken understanding between them now. They were both playing a game, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Arlen wasn't about to show his hand just yet. He had spent his life navigating through a web of politics and intrigue, and he knew better than to reveal his vulnerabilities too soon. But Lyra was something different. Her abilities were unlike anything he had ever seen, and though they hadn't fully manifested yet, he could feel the underlying current of power that surged beneath her calm exterior. For a moment, there was silence between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. Arlen exhaled slowly, breaking the stillness. "You've been here for a few days. I've seen the way you're watching me. Waiting for something." Lyra tilted her head, her eyes never leaving his. "And what do you think I'm waiting for?" "I think you're waiting for me to make a mistake," Arlen said, a slight edge to his voice. "You want me to show you that I'm weak, that I'm someone you can manipulate." "I don't need you to make a mistake," Lyra replied softly. "I'm not interested in your weakness. I'm interested in your strength. I want to know if you can control what you've unleashed." That statement hit Arlen like a jolt of electricity. There it was, the unspoken truth. She wasn't just testing his leadership, his authority. She was testing his ability to control her, to contain her power. And she was right. He couldn't control her, not yet. But Arlen Voss was not a man to back down from a challenge. If Lyra was looking for a test of wills, he would gladly oblige. He had spent years perfecting the art of command, of bending others to his will. If she thought she could outmaneuver him, she would learn quickly that he was no ordinary man. "Control?" Arlen echoed, his voice growing more intense. "You think I can't control you? You think you're the only one with power here?" Lyra didn't flinch. "I think you don't understand what I'm capable of." Arlen stepped closer, narrowing the distance between them. "Then show me. If you think you can, then show me. But know this, I'm not afraid of your power. I faced worse things than you." Lyra's gaze softened for just a moment, as if a flicker of something human passed through her. It was gone as quickly as it had come, but for a brief instant, Arlen saw a glimpse of vulnerability beneath the walls she had so carefully constructed. "Then we will see who truly holds the power," she whispered, her voice almost too quiet for him to hear. Before he could respond, she turned and walked toward the door. "I'll be in the galley, preparing your meal." Arlen stood in the middle of the room, his heart pounding with the weight of their conversation. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But he knew now that Lyra was not merely a servant. She was something far more dangerous, and the battle for control, for power, had only just begun. The days that followed Arlen's confrontation with Lyra were filled with a strange quietness. It was a silence thick with unspoken words, each of them carrying the weight of the unacknowledged power struggle that had begun to brew between them. Arlen, ever the strategist, knew that a direct clash of wills between them would lead nowhere. He had learned long ago that true control came not from force, but from understanding the intricacies of those around him. And Lyra, as enigmatic as she was dangerous, was a puzzle he needed to solve. Lyra, for her part, had not made another direct challenge. Instead, she kept to her duties as Arlen's servant, preparing meals, maintaining his quarters, and assisting with the ship's various tasks. It was a role she fulfilled with precision, but there was no warmth in her movements, no willingness to please. She worked like a machine, efficient but distant, and each action seemed calculated. It was as though she were marking time, waiting for something to change. For all her power, for all her defiance, Lyra knew she had no choice but to comply, for now. Arlen was not a fool. He had already shown that he was not intimidated by her, and though she could sense his calculation, she also knew that he was not blind to her potential. The balance between them was delicate. Any wrong move could tip the scales in a direction neither of them was prepared for. Arlen knew she was biding her time. The question was whether he could find a way to exploit her abilities before she turned the tables on him. He had already decided that he would not control her by force. He couldn't. He had to gain her trust, or at least her respect. And that would take more than just commands. It would take something that few had ever managed to cultivate in Lyra: patience. A week after their conversation, Arlen invited Lyra to the observation deck. It was an informal gesture, one that he hoped would break the ice between them. It was rare that Arlen asked anyone to join him in such a space. He preferred to keep his thoughts to himself, to remain in control of his environment. But he knew that this was a necessary step, an attempt to understand her, and perhaps to see what lay behind her guarded exterior. Lyra stood before the viewport, her violet eyes scanning the stars, her posture rigid as always. She was dressed in the simple tunic that had become her uniform since boarding Arlen's ship, the blue fabric in stark contrast to the cold metal walls of the observation deck. Arlen stood a few paces behind her, studying her, waiting for her to acknowledge him. It was a familiar dance. The man in control, the servant who would not be controlled. He took a deep breath before stepping closer, lowering his voice so it wouldn't sound like an order. "Why did you choose to speak to me like that the other day?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "You could have remained silent. You could have played the part of the obedient servant, and I might have overlooked the challenge. But you didn't. You pushed back. Why?" Lyra didn't immediately respond. Her gaze was fixed on the stars, her expression distant, as though contemplating his words. Finally, she turned her head slightly, enough to meet his gaze without fully turning her body toward him. Her lips barely moved when she spoke, but her words held a quiet intensity. "You asked me what I wanted," she said, "and I told you the truth. I don't want to be your servant. I don't want to be anyone's servant. I've never lived my life in servitude, and I won't begin now." Arlen nodded slowly, understanding the depth of her words. He had known she wasn't going to simply bow to him, but hearing it out loud was something else. There was an iron in her voice, a steel that could not be bent by the mere passage of time. "Then why stay?" Arlen asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. "If you don't want to be here, why don't you leave?" Lyra gave him a glance, her eyes flashing with something that might have been a smile, something faint and fleeting. "You think I can just leave? You think you can control where I go, where I stay? I'm not some helpless thing you can cage, Arlen. If I wanted to leave, I would. But I don't yet. You've provided me with something I need: information. I need to understand what you're really about. And if you find something you don't like?" Arlen asked, his voice almost a whisper. The tension between them was growing, each word pulling them closer to the precipice of something neither of them could fully predict. "I'll make my choice then," she replied, her tone resolute. "But not yet." The silence between them stretched, thick with implications. Arlen was no fool. Lyra's words were not just defiance. They were a challenge. She wasn't just testing his patience. She was testing his mind. She wanted to see if he would rise to meet her, if he would adapt, or if he would crumble under the weight of her resistance. "I'm not like the others," Lyra continued, her voice lower now. "I'm not some prize to be claimed, not some asset to be controlled. I am a force unto myself. If you understand that, then perhaps we can move forward. But if you see me only as a servant, then you will lose me, and with it whatever power I possess." Arlen considered her words carefully. He could feel the heat of her defiance, but there was also something in her words that resonated with him. There was something more than just pride beneath her resistance. Lyra was no simple servant. She was a being of immense power, a force that could shift the very balance of power in the galaxy if she so chose. The question was no longer whether he could control her, but whether he could convince her to align with him, to see him as an ally rather than a master. He wasn't just trying to bend her to his will, he was trying to build a partnership. The realization struck him like a sudden epiphany. This was not about dominance. It was about understanding. "Then let's understand each other," Arlen said, his voice firm but calm. "I don't expect you to bow. I never did. But I do expect you to listen. We both have something to gain here. You're not the only one with power, Lyra. I can offer you something that no one else can, a place where you're not just a tool to be used and discarded. A place where you can shape your own future." Lyra's eyes narrowed as she processed his words. She was silent for a long moment, as though weighing the sincerity in his voice. Finally, she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that spoke volumes. "Then let's see if you can live up to that promise," she said quietly. "I'll give you that chance." And with that, the first true step toward an uneasy alliance was taken. But Arlen knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. The battle for control was far from over. The next several weeks aboard Arlen's flagship passed with an unsettling sense of progress. Lyra no longer remained hidden in the background, but neither did she truly integrate with the crew. She began to perform her duties with an almost mechanical efficiency, but there was a quiet intensity to her movements, as if each action was a part of some larger plan. Arlen noticed that she never seemed to stay in one place for too long. She would work and then retreat, her mind always somewhere else, always watching, always calculating. In the quiet moments when they spoke, their conversations were more open, not entirely friendly but no longer entirely adversarial. It was clear that Lyra was still assessing him, weighing his words and actions, trying to decipher his true intentions. And Arlen, for his part, was doing the same. He had never expected her to simply fall in line. He had known from the beginning that Lyra was no ordinary alien to be subjugated. But in the hours they spent in conversation, there was a certain understanding forming between them, an understanding that both could potentially gain something from each other. One day, as they were en route to a new star system, Arlen found himself once again face to face with Lyra in the observation deck. It was becoming a place where they often met, a neutral ground where their worlds could collide without the formalities of hierarchy. "You're quiet today," Arlen remarked, noting the way Lyra stood, looking out into the stars, her posture rigid as always. Her violet eyes were focused, but they seemed distant, as if she were searching for something far beyond the confines of the observation deck. "I always think better when I'm alone," Lyra replied, her voice softer than usual. "The stars help me clear my mind." Arlen didn't respond immediately, instead leaning against the viewport, watching her as she gazed out. There was something different in her demeanor today. She wasn't merely the servant or the defiant alien anymore. There was a weight in her presence now, something deeper, something more than just resistance. "You've been thinking about something," Arlen said, breaking the silence. "What is it?" Lyra turned to face him, her gaze piercing and intense. "I've been thinking about where I fit in this, about what this partnership really means." Arlen's brow furrowed slightly. "And what do you think it means?" "I think you want something from me," Lyra said, her tone steady but sharp. "And I think you're starting to realize that I have the power to give it to you. But only if I choose to." Arlen met her gaze, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. He had known she was powerful, but this wasn't the same as before. This wasn't the defiance of a servant. This was the quiet realization of someone who had a bargaining chip and was willing to use it. "And what do you want in return?" Arlen asked, his voice low but steady. Lyra's lips curved into a small smile. It wasn't a friendly smile, but one that was knowing, as though she were pleased to have finally found common ground. "I want control," she said, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. "I want the freedom to make my own choices. You want power, Arlen, and you want to use me to gain more of it. But power isn't something you can control by force. You have to understand it. You have to give something to get something. Arlen felt a chill run down his spine at her words. She was right. He had always prided himself on his strategic mind, on his ability to control situations, but Lyra was proving to be an enigma. She wasn't someone to be controlled by brute strength or fear. She was an elemental force, and to harness her, he would have to understand her in ways no one else could. I'm offering you a place at my side, Arlen said, his voice steady. I'm offering you the freedom to choose your path, as long as that path aligns with mine. But you have to understand this. I will not be a subordinate. I will never be anyone's second. And I'm not asking you to be, Arlen replied, his voice calm but firm. But I need you to understand that I can offer you something that no one else can. Not just power. I can give you influence. A place where you can make a real difference. You can have more than just control over your own fate. You can change the fates of entire worlds. Lyra looked at him, her gaze unwavering. And what makes you think I'll believe that? What makes you think I'll trust you enough to give up my autonomy for a promise? Arlen met her eyes, the weight of his words heavy in the silence between them. Because I know what you're capable of. And I know that you understand the value of power. You won't find that power if you stay on your own. Not anymore. For a long moment, there was nothing but the hum of the ship and the distant stars. Lyra's expression remained unreadable, but Arlen could see the internal battle raging behind her eyes. She was still weighing her options, still trying to decide whether or not he was the kind of leader she could align with. Finally, Lyra spoke again, her voice softer this time. You still don't get it, do you? It's not about control. It's about respect. I don't need your influence, Arlen. I don't need your promises. What I need is the space to do what I do best. And what's that? Arlen asked, intrigued. Survive, Lyra said simply, her eyes narrowing slightly. I survived the fall of my people. I survived being sold into servitude. And I will survive whatever comes next. But if you want me by your side, you need to earn my trust. Arlen nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He had thought he could simply manipulate the situation, use her as a tool to further his ambitions. But Lyra was no tool. She was a partner waiting to be forged, if he could prove himself worthy. Then I'll earn it, Arlen said, his voice resolute. I'll prove that I can be someone you can trust. But it won't be easy. Lyra regarded him for a moment, her eyes searching his face for some sign of sincerity. When she found it, she gave a small nod. We'll see, she said, her voice a quiet challenge. The tension between them had shifted again, but this time it felt like something else had entered the equation. Something more like an alliance than a battle for dominance. The scales had tipped, but neither side had fully yielded. They were two forces, pulling and pushing against each other, but also beginning to recognize the power that the other held. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the ship, a new and fragile understanding began to form. Arlen wasn't just interested in Lyra's power anymore. He was beginning to respect the strength that lay beneath her defiance, and perhaps in time that respect could turn into something more. But for now, the battle continued, as both knew that trust could only be built through time, and time would tell whether their fragile alliance would hold or shatter under the pressure of what lay ahead. The weeks following their tense but revealing conversation saw a slow but tangible shift aboard Arlen's ship. Lyra's role as both servant and co-conspirator had evolved into something much more nuanced. She no longer served only as an obedient hand, but as a quiet shadow to Arlen's every move. Though still distant, she began to join him in strategizing, offering insights into galactic politics and the undercurrents of the black market. It was clear that her knowledge of the universe, and the hidden factions within it, was more valuable than anything Arlen could have anticipated. She wasn't just a prisoner of war. She was a key to unlocking the mysteries of the galaxy. In turn, Arlen had kept his promise. He had treated her with more respect than most would have, though his methods of gaining her trust were far from conventional. He allowed her autonomy in many ways, giving her the freedom to carve out her own space on the ship. He even permitted her to meet with certain members of the crew, not as a servant, but as an equal. It was a gesture that few would have extended to someone like her, But he had come to realize that to command Lyra, he needed more than obedience. He needed her loyalty, and loyalty could not be bought with fear alone. But even with all the progress made, the tension between them remained. Neither one had completely surrendered their reservations, and both were waiting for the other to make the next move, the next test of wills. Neither of them knew exactly what that would look like, but they both understood that it was coming. It came sooner than Arlen had expected. They were on the fringes of the Iridon cluster, a dangerous sector of space filled with pirates, rogue fleets, and intergalactic mercenaries. Arlen's mission was simple: secure an alliance with the Rim Alliance, a group of pirates that controlled most of the smuggling routes in the region. The Rim Alliance was notoriously unpredictable, and their leader, a brutal warlord named Jax Vorn, was known for bargaining with blood rather than words. Arlen had hoped that his presence, his reputation, would be enough to secure the alliance without a fight. But Lyra, who had grown increasingly skeptical of Arlen's ambitions, had warned him time and again that his methods were naive. Jax Vorn is not someone who can be trusted, Lyra had told him, her voice low but insistent. He won't respect you until you prove that you can match his brutality. He's a man who understands power only when it's shown to him directly. Arlen had dismissed her concerns. He believed that his diplomatic approach would win the day. But when they dropped out of hyperspace, the reality of the situation hit him harder than he had anticipated. A fleet of ships, sleek and menacing, emerged from the nebula, their guns trained on Arlen's vessel. The signal came through moments later, a transmission from Jax Vorn himself. Arlen Voss, Vorn's voice crackled over the comms, deep and grating. I hear you've come to make a deal. But before we talk, I think it's time for a little demonstration. Your ship, your crew, they will learn who holds the true power in this sector. Prepare yourself. Arlen clenched his fists. The situation had turned dangerous far quicker than he could have prepared for. The pirates weren't here to negotiate. They were here to take control, to test Arlen's resolve. It was a move he hadn't expected, but it was one that Lyra had warned him about. He turned to her, urgency in his eyes. Get to the bridge. We need a tactical plan now. Lyra didn't hesitate. She was already moving before he finished speaking, her body flowing with purpose, her mind already calculating. She knew the cost of failure in situations like this, and she knew that Arlen's reputation meant nothing if he couldn't deliver when it mattered most. The next few hours were a blur of commands and strategy. Arlen and Lyra worked in tandem, coordinating the ship's defenses, relaying messages to the crew, and plotting the most efficient route to get them out of the trap. But as the pirate fleet closed in, the true test came. You know they're going to attack, Lyra said, her tone serious, her eyes fixed on the readouts flashing on the bridge's console. They won't let you leave here alive unless you show them that you have power of your own. Arlen's gaze hardened. He had never been one to shy away from a fight, but he had never faced an adversary like Vorn. The Rim Alliance was a brutal, lawless group. They thrived on chaos and fear. And while Arlen had the tactical advantage, he knew that it wasn't enough. He would have to show Vorn something more, something that would demand respect. I'll do whatever it takes, Arlen replied, his voice low. You have my word. It was then that Lyra spoke again, her eyes narrowing with a quiet intensity. You'll have to trust me. Arlen turned to her, confused. What are you talking about? Lyra stepped forward, her expression serious. I can help you win this, but you need to let go of your pride. You need to accept that brute force alone won't work against someone like Vorn. You'll need more than just your tactics. You'll need a demonstration of power. Arlen hesitated. You're asking me to let you do what? Exactly? I'm asking you to let me show them who's really in control here, she said, her voice laced with something like a promise. Let me help you make them understand. The air between them crackled with an unspoken understanding. This wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about power. And Lyra was right, Arlen needed more than his reputation. He needed to show Vorn that he was a force to be reckoned with. With a single nod, Arlen stepped back. Do it, he said, his voice firm. Lyra's eyes glowed faintly with an intensity that matched the growing storm outside. She closed her eyes for a moment, her breath steadying, before she turned toward the ship's central control system. Her hand pressed against the console, and within seconds, the entire bridge seemed to tremble. Arlen watched, a mix of awe and apprehension in his chest, as the air around them seemed to ripple. The hum of the ship's systems grew louder, sharper. There was no doubt now that something incredible was happening. In the span of a heartbeat, the ship's weapons systems powered up, not just with conventional force, but with an intensity that sent waves of energy pulsing outward from the hull. A pulse of light shot out, a direct challenge, a surge of power meant for one thing: to break the pirate fleet before it even had a chance to fire. "Tell Vorn this is my response," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she had just unleashed. "If he wants control, he'll have to fight for it." Arlen nodded, his heart racing. He knew the message had been sent. The pirates would understand the power they were up against. They would have no choice but to respect it or die trying. He looked at Lyra, the bond between them solidifying. The battle for control wasn't over, but they had just taken the first step in claiming their own destiny. "We'll see if Vorn is ready for this," Arlen said, his voice filled with determination. "But no matter what happens next, this is just the beginning." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes flashing with something deeper than mere defiance. "It's just the beginning," she agreed. "For both of us, the end." Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stellar HFY content. Ring that bell to stay updated, and we'll see you next time.